Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our first Risk Conversations webinar of 2021. We wish everyone a very happy new year and good health, and we look forward to many Risk Conversations sessions with you throughout this year. I am Pamela Korn, the Geneva Association's Director of Communications and the moderator today. Our discussion today will explore the findings of our latest report, Social Inflation, Navigating the Evolving Claims Environment, authored by my colleague, Darren Pain. Darren very recently joined the Geneva Association as Director of Evolving Liability, and he will give us an overview of the report and the key findings. Frank Schmid, Chief Technology Officer of Guarnori, will drill deeper on one of the identified recent drivers of social inflation in the US, inequality. He will present parts of his study, Litigation, Environment, and Equality, and Frank kindly agreed to provide a presentation of the full study to all of you, to all of the participants in our follow-up email with the recording early this week. From Swiss Re, Carolina Ochoa is Head of Casualty Product Management, and Andrew Guarnori is Deputy Head of Financial Lines. Carolina and Andrew contributed a special feature to our social inflation report on international trends, and they will talk today about the extent to which social inflation is spreading beyond the US and the different factors at play internationally. I mentioned that Darren is our new Director of Evolving Liability, and in fact, his report on social inflation is the first publication under our new Evolving Liability workstream. And this is meant to illustrate that we see social inflation as a priority for insurers. Because while short-lived bouts of social inflation are manageable from a financial perspective, long-term social inflation could be damaging and threaten the abilities of insurers to carry out their vital support to society. COVID-19, of course, creates additional uncertainty about the liability claims environment, possibly strengthening the underlying drivers of social inflation, which we'll be discussing, and further hardening public attitudes towards corporations. On one hand, social inflation was an important issue before COVID-19. On the other, the pandemic has added another layer to the picture, making our report and conversation today, we think, even timelier. We look forward to your participation today, and the second half of the webinar will be a Q&A with our presenters, so you can ask a question either verbally by clicking the raise the hand button that you see there, and we will unmute you so you can speak to the presenters, or written by typing your question there into the box. You should feel free to raise your hand or submit your written question throughout the webinar, and then we will take note for the Q&A. So we can begin now with the summary of report findings by Darren Pain. So Darren, over to you.
Thanks, Pamela, and hello to everybody joining the call stroke video conference. As Pamela said, I'm the kind of primary author on the report, but I want to make clear that it was really much a joint effort, both involving people at the GA, but people more broadly, including some people on the call today, both presenters and listeners. I benefited immensely from speaking to various people across the sector, so a big thank you to everybody involved. So if we go to the next slide, about this is it, yeah. So, I mean, I think a key challenge in writing about social inflation is actually getting to grips with what it actually means. And I think there are at least two reasons why it's difficult to pin down as a concept. One is definitional, and the other relates to measurement. On the definitions, what this chart tries to do is to kind of isolate a broad and narrow definitions. On a narrow definition, some people see social inflation very much through the legal lens. The potential for litigation or shifts in liability standards and legal practices, as well as the proliferation of so-called nuclear verdicts or mega jury awards and new types of damages, and how they feed into insurance claims. So that's very much a narrow definition. But on a broader definition, social inflation encompasses all ways in which insurers' claims costs rise materially above what we normally call general economic inflation. That could, for instance, reflect new types of harmful substances, new emerging perils, shifts in societal attitudes, changing medical advances or medical costs, treatment costs. All those things go into the mix in terms of inflating claims costs facing insurance. Note in passing, and Pamela's already mentioned that COVID-19 has an implication here, and it has an implication for both the narrow and the broad definition. We could see COVID-19 showing up in either through the impact on the litigation and legal landscape, but also more broader societal changes. I said there were two reasons why it's tricky as a concept. The second reason why social inflation is a kind of elusive concept is its measurement. Normally, when you're thinking about economic inflation, you're typically trying to capture the change in prices of a common basket of goods and services. But for social inflation, there's no real common consistent reference basket. Claims and cases differ over time depending on the nature of circumstances and the extent of injuries. So this makes it hard to measure and monitor social inflation developments over time. Next slide, please. So given that background, we're often left looking at indirect measures of social inflation to see its effect. And this chart focuses on the annualized growth in US liability claims, comparing the last 4 or 5 years or so compared to the previous 5 years for various US liability claims across different classes. And what you can see is that there has been a rapid acceleration in the growth of liability claims for certain lines. I note in particular the commercial auto, but also some parts of general liability, of which D&O, or directors and officers insurance, is part. And you can kind of see that growth has been well in excess of consumer price inflation, which is the furthest bar to the right on the chart. So what we've seen is definitely an acceleration in claims for certain lines. But what this chart also shows is that for some lines at least, the latest acceleration represents a reversal of earlier falls in some of those claims. And for some of those lines, you see that their 2019 levels are not much different from what they were in 2007 once you've adjusted for general economic inflation. So I have to conclude from that chart, it's still unclear whether we've seen the recent acceleration in claims represents a temporary phenomenon that will unwind of its own accord, or whether it represents a shift to a much higher, newer, long-run trend in insurance claims, which is much more problematic for insurers and reinsurers to handle. And the COVID-19 only adds to that uncertainty about that long-run and short-run outlook. Next slide, please. So, given that uncertainty, what we often need to do is think about the underlying drivers, because the persistence and scale of social inflation is going to be dependent on those. So what the paper does is try to review the empirical evidence that's out there, largely through looking at US markets, but Andrew and Carolina later on in the presentation are going to look a little bit more broadly in international perspective. And it kind of looks at the various categories or possible reasons why we may well have seen that social inflation coming to the fore. In past episodes of heightened social inflation in the 1980s and early 2000s, lots of it was rooted in the unwinds or lapses in tort, the strength of torts, shifts in the reinterpretation of legal doctrines and liability standards. Most obviously, the application in joint and several liability, so that it was increased, the tort claims were increasingly going after those people with the deepest pockets, and as a result, claims costs skyrocket out of control. This ultimately led to a number of tort reforms going through in the US, not least of which was caps on non-economic damages. This time around, the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that that is a major factor that's underlying the recent acceleration in claims. There's been some localized sort of reversals of tort reforms, but that doesn't seem to be a major driver. Instead, we think, and certainly make the case in the paper, that there's three key drivers behind what's gone on recently. The first I would highlight is the aggressive strategies of the plaintiff's bar. That's been highly influential. The attorneys, particularly in the US, but more recently spreading internationally, have really been very active throughout the litigation process, right from client acquisition, pre-trial discovery, right through the trial itself. The other aspect that's been highly influential is the evolving litigation finance, in particular third-party litigation funding, in combination with a development in kind of collective redress mechanisms that enable people to group together to make litigation. That has been very, very prolific, particularly in US, but not exclusively in the US. And then the third type of evidence is thinking about societal shifts and whether there's been any shifts in juror or public sentiment against corporates, but in particular on the back of rising awareness of social inequalities and social injustices. And I think there's some evidence of that, and Frank is going to delve a little bit more deeply on that in the US. I think it's a very interesting aspect of it. Some of their evidence beyond the inequality, I think, is a little bit more kind of equivocal, but there's definitely some evidence that changing society attitudes towards the sort of injustices and inequality is laid behind some of these high jury awards that are feeding through to high claims inflation. Next slide, please. So given that, how should insurers position themselves? Well, as before, part of the response must be to engage with the legislators and policymakers to kind of level the litigation playing field. So more tort reform is probably part of the equation. So, for example, where there are no caps on economic damage, non-economic damages, we should look to push to promote those sorts of changes. Similarly, greater transparency in the claims process. Also, potential ways in which you can keep legal costs proportionate. So they're all part of the mix. Likewise, we've seen some repricing in the costs of some of this insurance, and the insurance cycle's turned, and that will help and support insurers as they adjust to this new claims environment. But along with tort, repricing is not likely to be enough. So the report makes the case for sort of 3 additional areas of focus. First, an enhanced focus on defense case management, better use of data analytics and predictive modeling to inform whether or not to litigate and where to litigate for that matter, and to evaluate potential fraud. The second one is better exposure modeling. Compared with property lines, I think casualty underwriting has been a little bit of a Cinderella in the sense that it's often relied less on formal models and more by underwriting expert judgment, and that must clearly play a role rather. But I think there's scope for making greater use of forward-looking models, more use of counterfactual analysis to better quantify some of the potential impact of social inflation on claims portfolios. And finally, the paper makes the case for more product innovation. So pushing insurers to move beyond just adapting new exclusionary language in policies and thinking a bit more creatively about different solutions that might be available, including parametric solutions, and eventually perhaps transfer some peak liability risks to capital markets. With that, I'm going to pass the baton on to Frank, who's going to delve a little bit more deeply on the inequality issue.
Thank you, Darren. And actually, before we move to Frank, we had a question come in that I think we can address at this stage while we're here in the key findings of the report. So on the related to the graph on the rise in claims in the US, we have the question from David Clark: is this change in loss volume or average loss severity? I believe it's volume, but maybe you would like to clarify here.
This is just the value of claims. So depending on how you, it's the total value of claims, which will reflect both the number of cases, but also their severity. Okay, great.
So thank you, Darren, for defining social inflation for us. We have the narrow definition and how it interplays with the broader definition. We saw evidence of social inflation demonstrated through a rise in claims in the US. You talked about the recommendations for insurers. And so now I think we, as you said, can move on to Frank, whose report, Litigation, Environment, and Inequality, ties together one of the identified underlying drivers, inequality, in the context of the US. So Frank, if you'd like to present your own research findings.
Yeah, thank you, Pamela. So it's a great honor to be on this panel today, and what I feel and we all feel is a highly relevant societal question. At Geneva, we're interested in quantifying social inflation and related to observable forces in society. So to drill down a little bit into the numbers. So specifically, we wanted to learn more about the influence of income inequality on the litigation environment in the United States. So slide 14. Thank you. Now, the link between the litigation environment and inequality relates to what is called the Bronx jury hypothesis, which was first posited by Tom Wolfe in his 1987 novel, The Bonfire of the Vanities. So in this novel, a lawyer refers to juries in the Bronx as vehicles for redistributing wealth. So what this study does, we look at to which degree the tort system, the judicial system, serves as a vehicle for redistributing wealth. The Bronx jury hypothesis was first studied by Cola Hausman in 2011, then at Columbia University. She's now at Yale University Law School. We study 4 publicly available data sets, 2 of which rest on actual jury trial outcomes, and 2 are based on survey results, and we refer to the survey results as perceived outcomes. So all evidence that I'm making available rests on cross-sectional variation, so not time variation. The cross-sectional variation is either across US counties or US states. To summarize our findings, and this is the right slide. First, the propensity observing a jury award in trucking accidents in excess of 10 million, commonly referred to as nuclear verdicts, increases with income inequality. So here we use state level data. Secondly, using county level data, damage awards in jury trials increase with income inequality. Third, using survey data at a state level, we find that a court is perceived by the defense bar as being more likely to side with the plaintiff where income inequality is high. And fourth, again, using county level data, there's evidence that a court is less likely to be perceived as fair and reasonable by corporate attorneys where income inequality is high. So finally, I do offer an exploratory analysis that indicates that a demonstrated cross-sectional link between jury outcomes and inequality has grown stronger over time. So I'll speak to the first 2 findings at a higher level, and as Pamela indicated, more detailed information and the empirical results on the other 2 data sets are available in a larger deck that will be made available to you following this webinar. So let's look at the next slide, please. Let's look at our first finding. So what you see here is a map of nuclear verdicts in trucking as published by the law firm Carr Allison, and the data spans the years 2011 through 2016. So in the chart, darker red coloring indicates higher income inequality as measured by the 5-year Gini index. So the 5-year Gini index is an average across 5 years of income inequality. So just based on the coloring of the map, a link between the propensity of observing a nuclear verdict and income inequality suggests itself. Slide 16. So what we do, clearly, we employ an econometric model here to study the propensity of observing a nuclear verdict in a given state as a function of income inequality while controlling for exposure. And we use 3 measures of inequality, the 1-year Gini index, a 5-year Gini index, and the poverty rate. And we find that a model is able to explain variation between observing a nuclear verdict and at least 1 nuclear verdict and not observing a nuclear verdict. And the contemporaneous 1-year Gini index is the most explanatory power and the highest predictive accuracy. So based on our estimates, eliminating the influence of variation in income inequality across states predicts a 40% decline in the count of nuclear verdicts based on the 1-year and 5-year Gini indexes, and 27% decline based on the poverty rate. So in conclusion, the cross-sectional variation in income inequality around the baseline is able to explain 25 to 40% of the observed nuclear verdicts in trucking. Next slide, please. So turning to the second of the two findings I would like to share with you today, here we focus on the magnitude of damage awards in jury trials. And we use data from the 2005 Civil Justice Survey of State Courts, which is the latest survey available. And the survey offers data on trial outcomes for a sample of 46 of the 75 most populous counties and a set of 95 counties outside that set of 75 most populous counties. In the data set provides county-level information on median damage awards in jury trials and bench trials, and the number of respective trials won by plaintiffs. And so what we do is we relate the median damage award in jury trials and separately bench trials to income inequality represented by the poverty rate, because at the county level, the Gini index is not available. And we control for influence related to the state in which the county is located. And we also relate the count of jury trials won by plaintiffs to the poverty rate. So both the jury trials, bench trials, and then also the count of jury trials won by plaintiffs. So what do we find? Slide 18. We find for the most populous counties a 1 standard deviation. Higher poverty rate translates into a 45% higher median damage award. That's a material magnitude. For the less populous counties, we cannot reject the null hypothesis of no relationship between court outcome and income inequality, possibly due to sparse data. It's quite sparse, in fact. There is no evidence of a link between the propensity of the plaintiff winning and the poverty rate. So we are able to show that it is really juries, as opposed to the bench, that translates income inequality into damage awards. It affects the magnitude, but not the probability of the plaintiff winning. Yeah, with that, thank you for attention, and back to Pamela.
Thank you very much, Frank. So we have seen your report findings now on the link between jury trial outcomes and awards and income inequality in the US. And so now we'd like to go beyond the US and hear from Carolina and Andrew on what they're seeing happening internationally, which countries are experiencing social inflation and the different factors at play and how this is maybe different from what's going on in the US.
Andrew, you're on mute.
So you're muted by organizer. That's better.
There you are.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you all. I'll start by introducing what Swiss Re have been doing in the social inflation space. So we've been working with our claims colleagues, Swiss Re Institute colleagues, on social inflation topic in the US for quite some time now. As part of this process, we decided to look in more detail about the international aspects of this. If we can turn to the next slide, you'll see a table appear which summarizes our findings around the drivers of social inflation. So for most of the US work, we came up with a number of drivers that we thought had international application. So 7 factors on the left-hand side, which we think are key drivers of social inflation as a process: population use, social media, litigation funding, collective redress, politics, legal, and income inequality, as Frank mentioned. Now, taking this view internationally, we will use the broad definition that Darren referred to earlier. So looking at anything that drives loss cost beyond pure economic factors. So social changes, propensity to sue, technology, all these kind of aspects come into all of this. And we score each of these drivers for a sample of countries. There's a cross-section here of key countries, not all countries, but areas where we can get decent data and have a subjective view of what's happening in different areas. Some of these drivers are very factual. So population youth, for example, is a very easy one to track statistically. The same with social media use, where again we look at internet access, we look at cell phone ownership, these kind of areas in quite quantitative methods. So we come inequality again, where we have the ability to look at the Gini coefficient, again assess that value. Others are far more subjective. So litigation funding, for example, we use a simple formula of are litigation funding firms active in the country? Do they have a presence there physically? Are they actually engaging in those countries? Collective redress, again, there's semi-factual work around that. Politics is far more subjective again. That depends very much on your view of the politics in a given country. We generally found there that more left-wing countries tend to be more socially aware and socially conscious, have higher social inflation than more right-wing or Republican-type countries. And then legal environment. Again, it says there common law versus civil law. Let's look at the whole aspect of how the legal systems work, how precedent follows, the trial systems, the court systems, how accessible it all is. And that again, we try to score subjectively along those lines. What you can see here is that the US on the left scores red on virtually all these factors. That's important to note. There's no weighting given to these, and the scores themselves do not have any assigned value. We think we can call them high, medium, low. We've also ranked them on this grid purely by the number of colours there are to each one of these factors. We haven't tried to weight or score it any more accurately than that. So it happens by this process, we hope objective process, that the US, Australia and the UK are on the left-hand side, and countries like France, Germany and Japan end up on the right-hand side. Now that doesn't give our view about social inflation in those countries, it simply gives where which these countries stack up when you rate them on those factors. But it seems broadly to correspond to what we're seeing in many of these markets. Now quite clearly there's a huge gap between the US and international. So the US has various unique factors that mean that the international trends will never get as bad as the US. Jury trials being the most obvious one, but also things like elected judges, whole systems over there are far more accessible and established, and the quality of the plaintiff bar in particular. But close behind that, Australia and the UK are showing many signs, even with the non-jury trial areas, of going some kind of way. And I think the willingness of the UK judges to revisit law is seen quite recently in the FSA test case in the UK on the business interruption claims. Again, we've got a situation where a court has taken an established precedent from the past and it's overturned that, given its view and aim of having a higher social objective. You can see here, as we go across the grid, more of the European countries tend to be towards the right, more of the Commonwealth, common law countries towards the left. Again, culture plays a part as well. We see Japan here on the extreme right. Japan, again, has been quite a less litigious society, quite an ordered society. Those kind of factors play into this very heavily. But it gives you some kind of feel for how we think these countries may stack up based on these objectives. I'm now turning to Carolina to give a bit more background about the conclusions we found from this.
Thank you, Andrew. As Andrew was saying, important is for us to keep in mind that there is no one driver, right, defining where we find social inflation, where we are going to see social inflation. It is rather a combination of different factors. We took, our best estimation of what those factors could be and how this could be playing a role and defining what the propensity is on social inflation. But there is not the one driver that is or has, in our view, more weight than others. There are a couple of things that we might observe are more important and are driving, the propensity, but typically there is not the one, as I said, the one driver. You see, as Andrew was saying, that Australia and the UK are on one end of the spectrum when it comes to propensity of presenting social inflation, having social inflation, and Andrew said it very, very well when he said, US stands out, and even if they are closer to the US, we definitely don't expect these countries to be at the same, at the extreme levels that we observe in the US. So it is important to keep that in perspective. Australia and the UK have more propensity, but we have observed also that many of these things are already manifesting in the countries. Just to bring you a couple of examples, in Australia, we had one workers' comp case where about 1 billion Australian dollars was awarded. And in the UK, we have it was one single baby with brain damage, very unfortunate. And the family was awarded 37 million pounds. So it gives you a sense of what you could observe in terms of the awards, and they are similar to what you observe in the US, but the magnitude, of course, is different. And as we say, these are examples, but we don't expect this to manifest in the same way as it does in the US. The middle countries are interesting, especially those in Europe, because as we observe this under the light of the European Union, what is important to note is that many of these countries might move in one or the other direction as a group. One example is the European Union new consumer agenda that will allow consumers to go for representative actions, including cross-border situations, so forum shopping, and allow these consumers to jointly seek redress and enforce their rights in this way. And this, as I said, it's something that would apply for European Union, and they would move in one or the other direction, most likely towards the higher end of the spectrum, so towards the red color in bulk. So one factor to keep in mind there is how we group countries and how we bring these countries who have similar features, similar legislation, similar policies in place, and how they would move in one or the other direction. And then from those countries in the middle of the table, the Netherlands stands out when it comes to litigation funding and a little bit of collective redress, because the Netherlands for some years have presented a much more active litigation funding activity, and it also has some class actions. In this country, we observe a lot of class actions and for some years. So even if you have countries in the European Union, you also need to observe the different characteristics or legislation initiatives that work at country level and might move one country in a different direction. And then Japan is at the other end of the spectrum, as showing the less propensity to social inflation. There are a number of factors there, mostly, as Andrew was saying, led by the legislation and cultural aspects. It doesn't mean that Japan would be at the end of the spectrum. It's just at the end of this spectrum of countries that we have picked here. But it's important to see that it clearly shows a low level of litigation, a low level of social inflation, and that probably when prioritizing, and going back to what Darren was saying at the beginning about actions to be taken, this gives a sense of where our actions should be prioritized and where we should focus our efforts at the beginning to address social inflation. With that, I'm going to go back to you, Pamela, in case there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Carolina and Andrew. We do have a few questions coming in, and we encourage everyone to participate. But Carolina, maybe before we turn to that, you had emphasized a great deal that there is no one driver of social inflation outside the US, but maybe you want to shed some light on the most important drivers of social inflation outside of the US.
Well, in our view, there are a couple of things that we need to probably be more vigilant about. One thing would be definitely legislation changes, and then also the social aspect, so the public sentiment and how this materializes in societal aspects. So this is one thing, as you were saying, Frank, right? You were mentioning about inequality and this sense of how people try to bring more equality in certain aspects, and that's also a reflection of how they feel and how the public sentiment works. So those will be the two or three things to be more mindful of when thinking about how social inflation might spread. Andrew, do you have any additional comment?
I want to add to that is litigation funding and legal accessibility aspects, because certainly having a desire to bring a claim is not always being able to bring a claim. And certainly in some countries like UK and Australia now, it's fairly easy to access law firms and funders who will help you bring a claim. That certainly is one of the key aspects here. There's the angle, public sentiment, and the ability to bring a claim from funding or from a law firm action.
Thank you both very much. So now we can turn to the audience. We do have hands raised and a few written questions. So I see a hand raised by Dickie Whitaker. So I can call on you if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the audience, the presenters, a question, and perhaps specify, Dickie, who your question is for. So let's see if we can get Dickie on the line. Dickie, can you hear us?
So, Pamela, can you hear me now?
We can, yes. Hello.
Thank you very much, all of you, for an interesting talk. My name is Dickie Whitaker, and I'm a founder and chief executive of an organization called the Light Hill Risk Network. And we're interested in this particular topic. So my question really is, I was interested by one of the conclusions, which was the need for improvement in exposure management and modeling. And my question really is to anybody who feels they can answer that question is, what additional research or information do you think would be useful to be able to get a better understanding and more certainty into this very important topic?
Darren, we can't hear you.
Darren, you're on mute.
So yes, I was going to see if anybody wanted to jump in. Perhaps Darren, since you're coming off fresh off of your research effort.
Yeah, I'm happy to give you a sort of high-level view. I'm sure that Andrew and Caroline and Frank may well have a bit more of a kind of ground-level view based on their underwriting experience. But from a high-level perspective, I think that we have the trouble with kind of liability exposure modeling is it's just probably much more difficult than property lines because the nature of the underlying drivers, and in particular how they interact, is just very, very difficult to quantify. But I think that there are things in which we can do, and in the paper we include an interesting box by one of the modeling firm vendors where they think about other ways in which we can use counterfactual analysis to provide some perspective on the future kind of claims evolution, try and get some idea of what might well have happened by looking at past cases if some of the factors that we've outlined today, litigation funding, societal attitudes, if they had been different at the time, to give you some idea of what the potential claims might well be for a similar type of circumstances. So I think that's an interesting avenue. More generally, there's a whole kind of sort of initiatives within the reinsurance and insurance community to try and think about more about the causal mechanisms that might well kind of underlie some of the elevated liability claims evolution, including some of the social inflation factors. But as I say, they are pretty difficult to do, but I think it's worth trying. But that's a high-level view. I don't know if Andrew, Frank, or Carolina have anything to add.
The other add to that really is the data quality out trying to collect this information is very difficult sometimes. So, getting accurate outside the USA, getting accurate information on the award levels made and court cases is actually quite difficult in any kind of credible area. So, let alone finding common drivers around what caused the claim, is it a social inflation related issue or not? So that transparency is a big problem internationally. Caroline, anything to add?
Yeah.
I would add that there are the two aspects to the modeling, right? The past and the future. And on the past, I totally agree with Andrew about transparency and the level of detail, the level of information that we get, specifically talking about casualty. And as you said, Darren, compared to property, right? It is very difficult to get the data we need to do proper modeling. And as we move in that direction and we want to get better there, the past information is crucial. The other thing is that we need to take risk about modeling and predicting the future, and that is not easy. But we need to define what is important for us and then try to model that and try to predict, correct the prediction, and be quicker in correcting those predictions to make sure that our model is as accurate as possible. So it is probably an exercise full of challenges, but that's where we need to, or the direction that we need to take going forward.
It is social science. It's more of an art than a science, to be honest. So Frank, you're
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I think we're all in agreement. I wanted to make exactly the same point, right? It starts with data, and data is hard to come by. If we had the more publicly available data sets, if the data were in the public domain, more modelers would actually try to study those data sets and help us gain insight. So if we creating a database so that is publicly available, I think would be a really good first step.
Thank you very much, everyone. There's an interesting written question here, and then we will go back to an audio question. Now this goes back to the identified drivers. Has anyone explored the statistic of lawyers per million in the population as a driver of social inflation? And so maybe if Swiss Re wants to begin, Carolina and Andrew.
I would start by saying it is not something. It sounds very interesting because it would give you a sense of how litigious a country might be, but it's not something that we definitely we have looked at in detail. The challenge that I would see in doing that is that lawyers are, as you know, they get to work in different fields, right? So it doesn't necessarily tell you a lot about court activity and litigiousness at the end of the day. But it would be a good thing to check just for out of curiosity. That's a good thing. Andrew,
one point I make there though is looking at the US cases in particular, it's a handful of law firms that dominate the large class actions. So the universe of lawyers isn't that useful given the specialised areas that lawyers practice in.
Just to add, I spoke to someone in the course of preparing the report, and they kind of were looking at that type of evidence, but there's some structural changes going on in the legal area. Andrew's kind of alluded to it with the consolidation that's going on in the legal world, so that you effectively don't necessarily have, it's not just the number, but it's actually the kind of influence and the consolidation of that influence amongst certain law firms that might be even more influential.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the scale of law firms, the resources they have available, how professional they are, those things are far bigger factors here than the straightforward number of lawyers. And again, in the US in particular, there are some very expert law firms who run this as a very profitable business and do very well at it because they are so well organized and so well resourced.
Yeah, I would add that the number of lawyers and the density of lawyers is probably driven by the economic opportunities, right? And that in turn is driven by, as we learned, by societal factors, economic conditions, and also then by the legal environment.
Okay, can you hear me? I got kicked off. Is it better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's stressful. Okay, we'll go now to the Geneva Association's Managing Director, Jad Aris. He has a question and he's raised his hand. So Jad, I will unmute you here.
Yes. Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you to Carolina, Frank, and Andrew for participating to this event organized by the Geneva Association. It's a pleasure. I had a question regarding this slide about the different countries. So I guess this is more for Carolina and Andrew. Two questions. The first one is, why do you, in the list of the drivers, why do you put the proportion of younger people aged below 15 as a driver? I wasn't sure what the rationale behind this was. And my second question is on politics and regulation. What type of regulation are you referring to? I was particularly interested in the fact that you were highlighting France and Spain, and I wasn't sure what precisely you were referring to. So I'd be interested in getting a little more substance on this. Thank you.
Yeah, population youth, really, that's the easier one of the two. So that really is down to being a proxy for younger people generally tend to be more radical, more socially focused, more family orientated. If they have young children of 15 and more families involved with society. we tend to find that those younger groups are more open to social inflation as a concept. They see more sort of anti-corporate sentiment there. So it's a kind of moving partly to politics, also attitudes, exchange of information, how open they are. They talk about things, they talk about award levels. They go to Facebook and they exchange information, and a motor accident, they got a claim, they've got £7,000 of workplace injury. These kind of things spread very quickly around those groups. They discuss everything, they share everything. So when you get something happening, the word spreads very quickly among those younger populations. There's that family aspect, it's the youth, the exchange aspect, communication aspect, several different things it acts as a proxy for. On the politics, this was the hardest one to score out of all of them. So again, the key issues there were the state of the government there, what we'd seen in terms of regulation and rules. You know, some governments are quite relaxed about how they encourage business and society. Others are far more harsh. And there's many factors behind this. I need to get more research into what's behind those two exactly. Carolina, any thoughts from your side?
Well, it is on politics and regulation, as you said, Andrew. It is hard, right? And it is probably the factor that really can change from one day to the other. Yet, because it really reflects a government's direction at a given time. So when you see Spain and France on the higher end, what we are trying to reflect is who is in government, what's the policy, and what we can't foresee the policy might be if it's more pro-consumer, for example, compared to more conservative, and what we could expect there in terms of policies, legislation being put in place, what type of legislative framework we are going to, or we can anticipate. But it is a very dynamic factor because it's going to change, it could change from one day to the other. If government changes, especially, for example, take Spain as an example. If government changes tomorrow for the complete opposite and it goes a little bit more on the right wing, then the picture completely changes, and we might anticipate that something in the other direction might come into place. So it is really a very difficult factor to put together, but what we are trying to address is what can we expect, or is reasonable to expect from the government in terms of protecting people, protecting especially consumers, and what measures are going to be put in place to protect people in which direction they are going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Carolina and Andrew. There are so many good questions coming in. We have one that is specifically on Frank's presentation, so I will now ask Frank. In the U.S. slides, this is Janet Wesner. In the U.S. slides, what other variables were analyzed for correlation along with poverty rates? Also, can you talk more about why poverty rates were used in place of income inequality?
Yeah, thank you, Pamela. Thank you for the question. Now, I did control for exposure, and I did control for state-level effects when we studied county-level data. Now, there are various measures of income inequality one can think of. Poverty rate is clearly one. The preferred and most commonly used measure is the Gini index. However, it is not available at county level. So in the United States, if one wants to study county level data, one is confined to the poverty rate, which is not an ideal measure because it's based on federal guidelines. It does not consider state level or county level economic conditions. So it's an imperfect measure, and I address this in the deck. But it is the poverty rate is one of the measures of income inequality that's commonly used.
Thank you very much, Frank. So now we'll go back to an audio question. Tim Fletcher has raised his hand. So Tim, I will unmute you and you can ask the presenters a question. Tim, are you with us? Okay, we will go back to a written question if I don't see any movement here. Okay, so we have a question from Keikato of Tokyo Marine. He has asked, can we view climate change litigation and the current COVID-19 business interruption claims litigation as a driver of social inflation? Your views would be much appreciated. So maybe Darren, would you like to begin on this one?
Sure, happy to. So taking them in reverse order, taking COVID-19, I don't necessarily think it as a separate factor. I see it as a sort of either an accelerant or an amplifier of some of those factors that we outlined. So for an example, to the extent that it's the aggressive nature of plaintiffs' attorneys that are being behind some of the social inflation, I can imagine that the episodes we've seen within the COVID-19 situation could kind of encourage even more of that activity, either bring forward its effect or amplify its effect. Similarly, you could, in links to the sort of societal attitudes, if to the extent that COVID-19 is being seen to disproportionately affect some parts of society more than others, that could be, again, add some fuel to some of that social inflation tendencies that ultimately gets kind of manifests itself in judge, juror, and court awards. So I think I see it more like that, the COVID-19 situation. On the climate litigation, again, I think that's an example of a particular topic that may well provide some fuel to some of these social inflation, rather than it being an individually separate topic on its own right. So, for example, and this is more probably in Andrew's space on the directors and officers space, if some of that climate, so the ESG type of and the pronouncements that get put into public documents for firms, if they ultimately turn out to be kind of what I've heard being like greenwashing, or are not as robust as they could be, that could be something that an aggressive plaintiff's attorney, particularly looking after their kind of shareholder clients, could go after in terms of providing some kind of seeking some redress from the directors and officers of that company who made those statements. So I think in total, I see it they're examples of these underlying factors and may well be catalysts too.
Thank you, Darren. Carolina or Andrew, would you like to weigh in?
I would agree. I completely agree with Darren. I think these two aspects are a reflection of other factors that we have we have mentioned. Cultural factors, how people feel, the generational aspect that Andrew was mentioning before. A lot of that is what we observe on the climate change litigation and how people feel about climate change, the environment in general, I would say. So yes, I totally agree with Darren.
I mentioned the FSA test case again because I think it's a good example in the UK where certainly that litigation was fast-tracked. You know, unusual legal techniques used to accelerate the case, get a decision very quickly for both the original case and the appeal. And again, the judge decided to overturn established case precedents to achieve a wider necessary social view. So that is a good example of how these kind of things do cause even non-jury systems to revise law in the face of the expectations of society as a whole. Huge political pressure there, public pressure there. You know, small businesses suffering, a need there to compensate, and a view there that the insurance industry should have to pay some of this. There's a good example of how these things do change.
Yeah, and I would like to add, yeah, based on my findings, I would conclude that forces that contribute to economic inequality and to conflict in society are likely to be drivers of social inflation, and that the legal system is a vehicle for redistribution of wealth and income.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your response. I've been messaging with Tim. We're going to try one more time to unmute, and if not, we have plenty of other questions. So let's see. Tim, are you there with your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I apologize for the mistake there. This is a fantastic presentation. A question for the group. One of the things that we're seeing here in the States with court systems, courtrooms being backlogged, dockets remaining crowded. What factor might that play with respect to social inflation? For example, might we see cases settle more quickly than we might have in the past, and or might it, because of concerns with social inflation, have an adverse effect on case values? In other words, cases settling at amounts greater than we might have seen in the past. Thank you.
I'll take a stab at, I'll take a stab. I mean, I think that it's not something we address specifically in the paper, but from my reading of the sort of the press and the media, I think it's still a little bit uncertain which way it will go. I think the settlement dynamics may well have kind of played into kind of a more, it may well have encouraged accelerated settlement, precisely because of the difficulties in holding out. But I guess it really depends. The counterbalance to that is essentially how aggressive some of the plaintiffs' attorneys might well be, and whether they can potentially exploit that situation further. But the evidence, I think, is a bit equivocal at the moment, but that's what my reading.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. From our side, it's been a very mixed picture. Again, most attorneys are clever. They won't settle on the cheap. They'll find the case. They'll find a way of, if they believe it's got a mess around it, of taking it up to a conclusion. Not going to give up money easily. So whether maybe some cash-strapped firms that might want to settle, if the case has merit, it will be taken all the way as per usual. But at this stage, it's too early. The courts have been closed. There's not much activity going on behind the scenes. It's all moving very slowly. It's early days yet. But longer term, we expect to see that backlog of anger there around this issue.
But to the extent the courts are closed, and I would probably turn this into a question to Frank, going back to your presentation, I would say that it is fair to assume that we could see less nuclear verdicts, nuclear cases, right? If at least from an inequality standpoint, that we would see less of that if those things get settled or move into the direction of being settled instead of going to court. What is your view, Frank?
Yeah, Carolina, I think my study is probably not granular enough to make a statement about this question. So my study is more high level. I think one would have to go much more granular and look at the individual cases to draw a conclusion.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Tim, for your question. I'm inclined to do one more question and then ask the presenters for final comments. So we have a question from Tim Kapler of Munich Re. Now, Tim, I will try to unmute you, but if not, I have your question written here, so let's try. Tim?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks first of all for sharing your insights. I've, in the meantime, two questions on litigation funding. First of all, is litigation funding a pure casualty topic? To what extent might other lines of business be affected by litigation funding, for instance, property, cyber, marine? And second question, if you may, what kind of cases is litigation funding targeting? Is it copyright IP? Is it rather consumer protection, insolvencies, healthcare, IT, energy? Or can you comment on the following hypothesis: not all litigation funding cases are relevant to insurance? Thanks.
I'll give a very quick answer on that. I'll try to anyway. So as far as the type of cases they're funding, it's a very broad remit indeed. I mean, the range of funding firms out there is phenomenal in terms of scope and nature of funding. You think about the big firms like Burford and INF, but on the Ridgeway, they're the larger cases. They're in a certain part of the market, but there's players in every single area. Also, the ATE and BTE insurance markets as well are a different form of funding. So it isn't just the post-event traditional fee-based funding, it's also the ability to bring a claim based on legal expenses insurance, for example. So across those groups, you've got a very wide spread of case type, from light commercial consumer cases through to heavily bodily injury cases, through to DNO and PI type cases. Really, the simple answer to this is they're after anything they can win and get a reward for. They're not concerned about the type of case, particularly beyond their own legal expertise. The question: does a case have merit, and will you get some recourse for it? That's often easier to get recourse when insurance is in place, but that isn't the sole concern.
Yep.
Is a firm able to pay? Yep. So things like IP, I'll target that because a firm could be a very wealthy firm that has the resources to pay that, even though it may well be uninsured. So a funder's concern really is, can I make money? Is the case going to win? And if I do win, can I get my money back? And that's what drives them, not so much the case type.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. So that will be it for questions today, though we did have a number more, and I will follow up with our presenters to try and get everyone answers to their questions. But for now, would our presenters like to make any final last comments, let's say 30 seconds each, if you'd like? Darren, would you want to begin?
Sure. So, well, many thanks for everybody that joined me on the panel today, but also those people that kind of listened in. I think it's I mean, I'm an economist by training, and I'm kind of not a lawyer, but I've learned a hell of a lot in writing this paper. So I found it immensely rewarding, kind of finding out about this stuff. And I think it's the sort of topic that is not going to have any hard and fast conclusions at the moment, and it's going to run and run. But I think that means it's something to watch.
Thank you, Darren. Carolina?
Thank you, Pamela. First of all, I just want to thank the Geneva Association for the opportunity for giving us the opportunity to working with them, with you, Darren, especially on the paper. It is a topic that we keep monitoring also at Swiss Re. We are working on it. We are trying to anticipate, as I was saying, as much as we can. And it is a topic that is not going away. So we definitely need to stay on top of it for some time now. So just want to say thank you for the questions, for listening in, and happy to answer any follow-up questions that you might have afterwards. Thanks.
Frank, please.
Thank you, Pamela. I would like to echo what Carolina said. I think this topic will stay with us for the foreseeable future, and there are societal forces, including global warming, in play that we need to watch closely. On that note, thank you very much for the opportunity to be on the panel. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank everybody for the time and the attention. It's been very interesting doing all of this. It's called social inflation for a reason. It is social. It's very hard to model it and understand it. And our real task is to try and stay ahead of it, especially in long tail lines like casualty, where the effect of this will be coming through for a number of years after what we're doing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, at the Geneva Association, we also look forward to continuing to follow the issue under our Evolving Liability workstream, the drivers we've identified, how additional drivers will play a bigger and bigger role. And we encourage you again to go read the report, which is on our website. And there's actually also, for those who have time constraints, a summary research brief. So please visit our website to get a view of those. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. I'm sorry for any technical trouble, but we look forward to seeing you again in our webinars this year. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.